What's up, Pandas? Peter von Panda here. Hey, I want to show you my Bell & Ross watch. As I'm unboxing it here, I'm going to tell you why I like Bell & Ross. It's not a very old company. Started in the 90s, and unlike Hewlett and Packard, the two founders are not Bell and Ross. It's like, I don't know what it is, but it's Bell something and Rossini or something like that. So, you know, Bell & Ross rolls off the tongue a little easier. But I really like them because even though they're relatively new, they've kind of stayed pretty high end. As you can see, this watch is going to be a vintage WW1-92 Bell & Ross. The fact that their logo here is the ampersand inside the circle is interesting to me because their whole thing is and, right? So WW1 stands for World War I. It also stands for Wristwatch 1. World War I and Wristwatch 1. So this is kind of their thing. You know, style and functionality, time and blah, 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 blah. All right. So it's kind of a little bit of, I don't know. Doesn't really mean much to me, but I do kind of like that logo, Bell & Ross. So in this box, cardboard box, here is the watch. And I want to show this sucker to you because I like it. Boom, right there. This is a watch, and I'm showing it to you because there are very few videos on it, and I would think there'd be more. You know, it's not a true unboxing. This is a watch that's seen somewhere, but I want to show it to you how it comes. It comes like this. There is some, you know, depending on where you get it, there's some warranty cards and certificate of authenticity and things like that. But this is the watch, and why it convinced me to buy a watch from Bell & Ross is because, one, it's a limited edition, but secondly, I really just plain liked it. I've actually really been interested in a Bell & Ross watch for a while, and the one that's really common is the BR series. You know, they look like aviation gauges, kind of square. But, you know, Bell & Rosses are expensive. You're talking about $5,000-6,000 for a watch that, you know, in those square aviator watches, if I were an aviator, yeah, I'd wear one because it's kind of a cool thing. But if you're not, well, you know, I don't know where you'd wear it. They're kind of casual and bold, and I don't know. It's a conversation piece that I would have some trouble working into my conversation. But I got this one because it's a little more mainstream. It's formal, it's casual, it's kind of the best of both worlds. But what's really cool about it is what it represents and how unique and rare it is, really. Now, I'm going to try not to be too verbose about this watch because there's a lot of ground that I want to cover in a very short order. First of all, Bell & Ross, like a lot of companies, are kind of going with this vintage look, this kind of vintage style. But in some ways, I think Bell & Ross, in this particular WW1 watch, has a little bit more claim to it. So first of all, the whole company has been dedicated to aviation-themed watches. And, you know, like I said, the BR series of watches are lifted. I mean, they're basically watch versions of airplane gauges. So this limited edition, which honors Georges Guynemer, a World War I ace, flying ace from France, as Bell & Ross is from France, makes a lot of sense. Making aviation-style watches, make a limited edition watch in honor of an aviator, and boom, there is Mr. Guynemer. He's laser etched here on the back on this kind of really nice matte gray finish. It's a PVD finish on, I think, bead blasted stainless steel. So you can see him there in black, and then there's a limited edition number. This is 1 of 500, so a really low production. The etched in information here is automatic stainless steel. WW1-92, blah, 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 blah. You can see water resistant to 50 meters and Swiss made, even though any company, even though it's based somewhere, you know, manufactures in Switzerland, because it's always, you know, the thing that everyone wants. I really love the finish here because, one, it doesn't show fingerprints. It kind of, this coating, this PVD coating has been super, super durable. You know, it looks great, even though this was, you know, a worn watch. And it's just kind of different than having the flashy, or, you know, polished steel or even bead blasted but shiny steel. So it kind of gives it a little bit more of a subtle look, especially on the wrist. And it's not a big watch. It's only 44 millimeters. Now, what I would say is that you might be like, 44 millimeters, it looks like it's bigger than that. Well, one of the reasons that it kind of gives you this optical illusion that it looks bigger is because the band is so narrow. I don't remember exactly what the width on the band is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's an 18 or 20 millimeter. And actually, I think it's might even be a little narrower than 18 millimeters. That is intentional because The cool thing about wristwatches is that they were really born out of aviation. So pocket watches were all the rage, and military aviators needed watches, good timers, to effectively do their job, but they couldn't use a pocket watch, obviously. So basically, what they did was they adapted pocket watches to be worn on the wrist. Thus, the birth of wristwatches. It wasn't until later that they became popular, and you'd be surprised because this is obviously the only way you'd carry a clock, even though pocket watches are kind of coming back a little bit these days. I've never seen one in the wild, but they're kind of in vogue. And so it's a really nice looking watch because it's not super big, 44 millimeters here, but a narrow band. And so what they use is very narrow bands. And so Bell and Ross intentionally used a narrow band here to kind of mimic those early aviator style watches, which is actually fairly different than a lot of these early aviation style watches that use kind of a more traditional 22, 24 millimeter wide band. Now, the other thing that I think is fairly authentic, they've made these wire lugs. You can see they're uniform and they're really straight. They kind of come out, and if you look at it from the side, you can see how straight they are. The wire is straight, although it's angled down, but they don't curve like a lot of watches. And that was intentional, as I mentioned, because when the pocket watches were adapted to wristwatches, what they did is just kind of weld or solder on wires to make lugs to hold a band. In fact, I think some of them were kind of run through the band first and then soldered on because they didn't have like removable pieces like a spring bar like you would now. And so this is actually kind of an authentic look, although there's really nothing authentic about them taking a case and then modifying it with lugs. So, this was obviously designed from the get-go to be a wristwatch. You can see a little bit of a seam here where there's a kind of probably two pieces brought together. The crown here is nice and interesting. It has a coin edge. It's not a huge onion crown, but pretty typical. And there is that logo that we mentioned, because Bell and Ross is always Bell and Ross. Something and something is kind of their little catchphrase. So really cool. It is machined in there, has some depth, and is really nice. And like I said, I love the color because it's kind of unique and super durable. Now, the watch band is also a little bit unique in that you've seen watch bands like this. Look at the painted edges, really nice leather and very comfortable, contrasting stitching. But again, they've taken that and logo and kind of branded it into the leather or pressed it in here somehow. I really like that. One of the things that it's subtle, it's small, it's kind of on the back, so it'll be on the bottom of the watch band for you. So it's not going to be something really bold, so you don't have to be a total show hog to wear it. But what I like about it is people who reclaim vintage leather, make vintage leather watch bands that you can put on your watches these days, will often have like Wilson or, depending if they reclaimed it from a football or a baseball glove. And it's kind of a little bit of a homage to that, because I really like those vintage watch bands that have kind of the old brands and logos and things like that still on them. It kind of gives a little history. The buckle is also pretty cool too. It's actually, it's kind of this without wire shape, but the and logo and the Bell & Ross logo is kind of molded in here, just like it is on the crown, and the blade right there kind of fits very accurately into that little notch. So really cool. I like when there are a lot of small details as opposed to just taking the buckle and sandblasting the name in there. They've done something a little different and really stayed true to kind of the wire lug look. So cool there. Just a little bit of the contrasting stitching, sewing the ends up here, and it's just it's a nice looking band on a nice looking watch. Now let's get to the business end of this watch. It's an automatic. I don't remember what Bell & Ross calls this caliber, but as far as I know, it is essentially an ETA 2892, I believe. So let's get that out of the way. All right, so you can see the logo in all its glory. Now, if you're familiar with the 2892, great, reliable, good timing watch, or a movement, a cost certified, I believe. But the cool thing about it, and what I actually respect Bell & Ross for doing, is the movement, I believe, has a date wheel. Now you'll notice there's no date on the front of this watch. And why? You're saying, Peter, would you like that? There's a feature built into the movement. If I'm right about this movement, if I'm not, put it in the comments and flame me. But if I'm right, what I like is that they looked at this watch and said, regardless of the movement, we're only going to make a 3-hand functionality on it, like kind of original watches were. We're not going to use every feature. And so you're kind of looking at what you can do and separating that from what you should do. And in this case, I think what they should have done is what they did and kept it dead nuts simple. And it's better for it. If they had done something clever like take the Bell & Ross and ampersand logo out and made that hole there the date window, I could have respected that too. But I don't want to see just a cutout date window that wouldn't have been on a kind of in a vintage early watch if it wasn't supposed to be there. So I respect them for doing that. Yes, as a buyer of a watch, I'm not getting all the functionality that's kind of built into the movement, but I don't care about that. Now, the Opaline Dial here is really, really cool. And in fact, it has a little bit of kind of like a tan gold shimmer, like a little champagne shimmer, and it just matches everything really, really well, right? Just kind of gives you a little hint of vintageness, and the Opaline is really beautiful, right? It's super metallic, pearlescent. It's so subtle, but it's like, for me, kind of the little details that really raise the perceived value. A lot of watches have, flat or shiny dials, and there's just something about this, just that little tiny shimmer in it that kind of really makes it feel and look premium. So I hope you agree with that. Kind of this railroad track outer chapter line here with the minute marks and the darker hour marks. It's really cool. Kind of brings the dial in a little bit, in my opinion. 44 millimeters, it might be a big watch for a lot of people, but kind of makes the watch feel just a little smaller. And I just love those details, really, those fine lines. Bell & Ross logo is beautiful there, and Swiss made at the lower part piece here. Now, a couple quick things. Obviously, you're seeing this bird here. That's a stork. It's a red stork, which was the squadron logo for the Guynemer squadron. And kind of, I believe he was the head of it. And it's interesting. There are some interesting dogfights that he was a part of. He was an ace. He was killed in action and died on September 11th, which is easy to remember because of September 11th. I don't remember what year he died in, presumably during the war at some point, though. But this red stork was their logo. It was on their planes, and it's on this watch. Now, what's interesting to me is that if you go online and look at pictures in some of the early reviews, the stork is flying left on this watch, and in some of the early pictures, he's flying right. And it's my understanding that the production watches have the stork facing left, and the early prototypes had the stork flying right. So if you're looking at pictures and kind of reading reviews and experiences with the watch, you'll see pictures with the stork in pointing in two different directions, and I believe that is intentional to kind of separate the non-numbered prototypes. Okay, I won't swear by that. But let's get to the Arabic numerals here, which are pretty cool. They kind of have that vintage look and feel. There's kind of these little serifs on some of the edges. But what I think is intentional here too is the 2 here, the font matches the font that they used on the 2 that was painted on the plane, and presumably on Guynemer's plane. But then presumably, I don't know if there was a number 3 on one of the other planes in his squadron or something like that, but they would presumably look like these numbers. I can't verify that. To be really honest, I looked at some pictures, and yes, some of the kind of the pictures of his plane have a 2 like this. Some other pictures, the picture of his plane, which I believe hangs in a museum in France, the 2 is a little different. Now, I'm sure that may be due to restoration and et cetera, but I think that was the kind of the intention of the style of font that they used, but I don't know that I've conclusively seen every picture of his plane. Some seemed like it had that number 2 there, and some did not. Okay, not a big deal. But I will tell you that I have the Glycine F104 limited edition, and these numbers look very, very similar. I'll show you that a little later. Now, the other thing that I will tell you is that there's Super-Luminova not only on the numbers, but also on these blued hands. And you can see that it's just kind of a nice tan. It's kind of like a flat, dark earth. It's cool because you wouldn't necessarily notice it and say, wow, that's Super-Luminova, because a lot of Super-Luminova tends to try to look as white as possible, or sometimes just has a little bit of off-white or even kind of a little tinge of green to it. So it's pretty cool to me that they've got this color that really blends in and looks vintage. Now, the cool thing, one of the things that I really am impressed by, and here's where I'm making the assumption, but when you look at these numbers, you can see that all the numbers, the Super-Luminova that's applied, it might be a little hard to see on camera here, is kind of raised. They kind of look like bubble numbers. You can kind of see it in the lighting here, where there's depth to each of the numbers. And it's my understanding, and I first became aware of this on Franck Mueller's, where they will print the numbers and the outline of it, and then someone with basically a tiny needle that injects the Super-Luminova will kind of paint it in by hand. It's gonna, they'll kind of do it by hand under a magnifying glass, and I think that's how this is applied. Now, I'd love for someone to confirm that, but when it's raised like that, it's kind of a telltale sign that you've had someone actually painstakingly kind of color this in and kind of color fill each of those numbers. Thus, you get this raised effect, and there's a little bit of inconsistency with it. As with all hand run work, you can see here, on that 2, there's a little bit of a hump right on the bottom portion of the 2 where there's a little bit of extra material. That's kind of the nature of where 2 areas come together. But it's not as consistent as if a machine were just kind of stamping ink down onto the dial. I like it. If Bell & Ross actually hand applied the Super-Luminova, I'm digging it. Thank you for whoever spent your time and your precise, steady hands to do it. And it's one of those things you'd maybe never notice, but makes a premium watch a premium watch. Okay, so I also love the blued hands. I mean, I've just been a sucker for that. The iridescence of them, it looks like an anodized blue. I'm just always kind of into that. They look black sometimes at a distance and different lights, but you really get the light shining on them, and they really have this really high contrast blue. I love it. Unfortunately, there's no exhibition back window here to see the movement, but I even like when they blew the screws. I just really sit there for hours and hours and hours and stare at them, and my mouth waters, and I'm like, oh, you're so gorgeous. And then I usually lick and kiss the watch and then fall asleep and clutching it to my bosom. So cool there. And then, these large drawn leaf hands are sleek, they're beautiful, they're elegant, they're so detailed. I mean, so thin and delicate. I just really dig that. As you can see, the second hand and the long minute hand here don't quite reach this railroad track outer chapter ring, and the hour hand kind of just barely touches on the Arabic numerals as it goes around. So cool looking watch, and the Bell & Ross is in black. Now, let me mention here that I like pretty much everything about this watch. They are pretty expensive. They only made 500 like every limited edition, but there are a lot of watches that have a lot more features too. Absolutely. And some of the other Bell & Rosses, even in this style, they have this WW1 and WW2 style watches, and so you can get kind of these aviator style watches that are going to be more modern. They're going to use more features on the movement. That being said, this watch was, I think, $4,000 or $4,500. You can find them around now for maybe a little less if you can find them at all. I think they went pretty quick, but Bell & Ross's, you can buy new ones with that are mass produced, that are as mass produced as a Bell & Ross would be, for $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. I mean, that's an easy amount of money to spend on a Bell & Ross. Now, I want to make a confession. Peter Von Panda is going to tell you something, and I don't want it to get out. But I am not going to buy any more of these vintage dialed aviator style watches. And my issue with it is I love the design, and I realize that I get suckered into these types of design because, to be honest, the Glycine F104, which I've shown you before, is very similar. Blued hands, similar numbers, as you can see. The color on the color fill on with the Super-Luminova is very similar. You know, different style here, minute markings, some second markings, and chapter ring. But you know, again, it's kind of doing a similar, going after a similar look in a similar market. And I'm not into spending more money to have a bunch of watches that look very similar. Okay. The other thing I throw out there is Shinola kind of did it too. They've got a kind of similar look. You know, they went for kind of a historic look, and even the R page. You know, and the reason, and it's not R page's fault, because they bought vintage dials and vintage movements, so it's no wonder they look very vintagey. But what I'm starting to realize is I have a problem, and for all of you guys that get watches. You can start having a problem where you have a lot of watches that fill a very similar space in your collection. So I'm not buying anymore. That's my promise to you and to me. But anyway, the Bell & Ross Georges Guynemer limited edition WW1 automatic is absolutely awesome. It's probably the most wearable out of these because it's a 47mm, 47mm, 44mm, but fairly heavy. This is a 44, but it's nice, light, thin, durable, and really looks great. So hopefully you can find one. Hopefully that helps you decide if you want to pick up a Bell & Ross as well. But I really love it, and I hope you do too. Peter from Panda, out.